Hello guys, and welcome back to another video. Now then, today I'm going to be talking about the main reasons why your heater in your car may not be working, and I'm actually going to be working on my BMW E65 series today, but this video is not specific to BMWs. It's pretty much the same for all the cars, so I hope you find this video somewhat helpful. But without further ado, let's get outside and let's get cracking. Okay then, so we are outside now. I'm actually going to go ahead and get in the car first of all. And I'm actually going to fire the engine up because obviously the engine has to be running for the heater to work. Okay then, so to begin with, we'll start off with some basic stuff. So obviously we have the climate controls here. We obviously have a temperature gauge on here as well. I believe this is in Celsius, but in your car it may be in Fahrenheit. You know, we just want to make sure that this is all the way to the warm. So in our case it is to 26 or 27 degrees Celsius. So we'll do that on both of them, so it's going to give us the best chance possible. And obviously we have the motor here which controls the velocity of the air coming out, and obviously you want to make sure that your vents are open as well. So as you can see, all the vents are open all of the way. Okay then, so that is the basic stuff out the way. Then let's say we take it for a drive. You know, we've been driving for 15-20 minutes or so, and we think the car must be up to operating temperature now, and we notice that we still do not have hot air blowing from the vents. Now I'm actually going to step outside and head into the engine bay, and I'll show you a few things that is worth pointing out, and it may actually help you diagnosing why you are not getting the hot air coming from your vents. So then, the first and probably most common cause why you may not be getting hot air blown from your vents is actually because your coolant or antifreeze may not be getting up to temperature in the first place. And if we take a look down here, we see a thermostat. This basically opens and closes at typically around 90 degrees Celsius. This obviously allows coolant to flow from the engine to other areas of the car, for example to the heater matrix. And of course, if the thermostat is faulty, then we are not going to get the hot air, because we're not even going to get the coolant warm enough to in fact heat the air. Now the easiest way of telling if you have a faulty thermostat or not is just checking your temperature gauge. If you do not have an analog temperature gauge, there is many ways that you can enter the secret menu, especially on a BMW. You can enter the secret menu and then check your coolant temperature that way. It should typically be up to operating temperature after around 15 to 20 minutes of moderate driving. If you're still nowhere near that 90 degrees Celsius mark, then there is a good chance that your thermostat is at fault. And it's also worth mentioning that some models of cars have multiple thermostat. In our case, this car only has just the one, but there is sometimes a separate thermostat for the EGR system or for the transmission. So it is worth checking to see if all of your thermostats are working correctly. The next common problem then why your heater may not be blowing out hot air is if your heater core is actually blocked. So if we take a look down here, and I appreciate it's pretty hard to see, but we can see the firewall, and we have a couple of pipes running from there. So we have one running to the firewall that's going to the heater core, and then we have a return one that comes from the heater core. Now if you haven't done a coolant flush in a long time, or if it's been a good number of years before it has had a coolant flush, there's a good chance that is going to be pretty stopped up. And if you take a look in the coolant tank, you can see that our coolant is very clean, and that's because we have done a coolant flush in the last 6 months. We've done a full coolant flush and got all of the old coolant and crud that was built up over the years in the coolant system, and we flushed it out with some nice new proper coolant. And so that's one of the main reasons why it is important to do a coolant flush, because if you don't, you get a lot of the old breakdown, corrosion, all sitting in the heater core, and that can make it block up. And that's one of the main reasons why people complain of their heaters not blowing out hot air. Another reason then why your heater may not be blowing out hot air is if your coolant level is too low. Maybe you have some sort of leak, or maybe you are in fact burning coolant, which is a much bigger problem than you ideally want. But as you can see on here, we have a level, so we have a max and we have a min. Obviously you want it to be somewhere between the two of them. Obviously mine is just between the minimum and the maximum. If you have a low coolant, or if you have a leak, then obviously you're not going to get the proper flow of coolant to the heater core, and that's in fact not going to heat the air that you want. I've actually had a situation before where I was driving, it was a very cold morning, I just noticed that my heaters just went out completely. It stopped blowing hot air and it only blew out cold air like almost instantly, and that's when I knew I had a problem, because my temperature gauge was in fact going up, and that's when I knew for a fact I had a leak. And what actually happened was one of the coolant pipes here had actually split, and that's when I knew I had quite a big problem, and obviously had to pull over immediately. Another reason why you may not be getting hot air coming out of your vents, why your heater may not be working correctly, is if we take a look down here, we have a heater control valve, and this essentially controls the amount of coolant going from the engine to the heater core. So if this thing isn't working correctly, if we have a fault code for this, then that may be the problem for your heater not working essentially. And for the final common problem in the engine bay then would just be for the incorrect mix when it comes to the coolant antifreeze. So obviously you want to make sure that you follow the factory specifications when it comes to your coolant antifreeze mix, and you want to make sure that you are choosing the correct mix for your climate. So if you are living in a climate which is minus 20 degrees Celsius, then you need to make sure you have a high antifreeze mix which is appropriate for your climate. Likewise, if you live in a very warm climate, you're not going to need much antifreeze at all, and you're going to need more coolant. So it's worth mentioning that you need to make sure that you have a proper antifreeze coolant mix, because if you don't, then you may be running too cold or in fact too warm. And now I'm going to actually take you inside of the car, where I'm actually going to show you a common problem, especially with BMWs, where people cannot seem to get hot air blowing from their vents. Okay then, so this is going to be relevant for BMWs, especially BMWs that have the iDrive system. So obviously we can see we are at the main menu right here, but then if we go ahead and scroll down to settings, and then if we was to scroll down to climate, and then if we was to select the first one, which is ventilation temperature, we can see that we actually have another dial here. So if I switch the ignition on, we can see that we actually have another dial which we can actually toggle with the iDrive wheel. So as we saw, you know, the needle was pointing towards the cold. Now if this is the case, no matter how much heat you apply to this dial here, if this is fully on the cold, you're not going to get hot air blowing from your vents. So it's worth checking, it's worth going into your iDrive settings, into the ventilation temperature settings, and making sure that this is pointing to the relevant heat settings. Obviously if we want it as hot as possible, we're going to have it pointing all the way to the hot. If we want it cold, so if, for example, we want our AC running, we're going to have it pointing there. And if we want it somewhere in the middle, you know, a good mix of the heat and cool, then we are going to want it somewhere in the middle. But let's say, for example, it's a very cold morning, we want to get the car as hot as possible, as quick as possible. We want to have that all the way on the heat, have the both sides of the climate control dials set to the hottest, and then obviously control the fan speed just there. Now this is really something that is not that obvious from factory. You know, if you see climate control dials on here, you would expect to just turn these to the relevant temperature and that would be it pretty much. But the fact that you actually have to go into the iDrive settings, to the climate settings, and then to the ventilation temperature, and then obviously you can set the ventilation temperature, you know, it's quite a bit of work. It's not the most obvious thing from factory, to be honest. But if you have checked everything that I have previously mentioned, so you know, you've checked these dials are all the way on the heat, you know, you have taken your car for a nice decent drive to get up to what you think is the operating temperature, you know, maybe you went ahead and checked the coolant temperature and it is around the 90 degrees, and then you find out you're still not getting hot air blowing from your vents, there's a good chance that this is your problem. Okay then, so I hope this video has been somewhat helpful. I hope it's helped to get your heaters in your car working again. If it has been somewhat helpful and you have enjoyed it, please remember to give it a like, leave a comment down below, subscribe if you have not already done so, because I've got a lot more videos like this to come on the way, and I will see you all in that next one. Peace!